I'm here with Luis Crouch of RTI. Luis, thanks for joining. Luis, I know you've done a lot of work on education and education systems, um, but I want to ask you specifically about one paper that you wrote recently titled Systems Implications for Core Instructional Support, Lessons from Sobral, Brazil, Puebla, Mexico, and Kenya. So if you could just kind of start us off by telling me what the research question was that you were trying to answer in that paper and how you went about doing that.
Okay, sure. Well, I guess the research question was this. There are examples from around the world of efforts or interventions that have actually boosted learning in a very significant way, and even fairly quickly. But they've mostly been projects run by NGOs or an experimental approach run by a government. There have been very few cases of system-wide improvements that rely on the standard managerial approaches of the whole ministry.
Mm.
So we looked around the world for cases that were recent and not in some place like Finland or Korea, but in developing countries, and that could hold some lessons for how do you take something that might be small scale and take it to the system or even start at scale. And so that's what we did, and we looked around, and these three cases stood out: of Kenya, the municipality of Sobral in northeast Brazil, and the state of Puebla in central Mexico.
And can you talk a little bit about kind of what made why did you choose these systems, or like kind of the process for coming to these three?
Well, that there were improvements for what? Well, obviously they were at scale. Number one. Number two, they managed to achieve change probably within 3 to 5 years. You could see the change in 2 years. There was solid, obvious change within 5. So not a 20-year reform process, and these are not like a thorough reform of the systems. These, I have to admit, these are pretty much focused on, pretty basic skills. This is not about implanting deep critical thinking. This is about improving reading and math. So, let's be clear that the ambition was not always huge. And then importantly, the results were big. So Sobral moved from a typical sort of poor country performance to performance sort of at the bottom of the developed country range. So they went from, your typical sort of, Sobral is one of the poorest municipalities in Brazil, so you can imagine, to performance at the level of maybe, Greece or one of the kind of not super high performing OECD countries, but at that level, basically. So that's pretty remarkable in about 5 years. So yeah, the improvement in performance was a big criterion.
And in terms of the scale of something like, say, Sobral or Puebla, kind of how big are these systems?
Okay, that's a really good question, and they range. Now these are all at scale, namely they pertain to the entire system that's controlled by the managers of that system, by the state minister or the municipal equivalent of a minister, and they range. Sobral is very small. I think it's about 150 schools, if I recall. Puebla is about 4,000, 5,000. So that's,
wow.
That could be the size of a small country. And Kenya is big. If I remember correctly, it's tens of thousands of schools, 25, 30,000. I don't recall the exact details, but it's tens of thousands of schools. So that's a big.
Okay, so quite a range.
From small to big, but they're all at scale. Namely, they are at the scale of the system that's actually controlled by the people who run the system.
By the unit, yeah. Okay. So I'd be curious now to hear what were the key findings from this research process that you undertook.
Yeah, so we wanted to see what it was that they did, and distill it into maybe, I don't know, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 messages.
Yeah.
Not more than 10, a limited number of messages. Okay, one of them was leadership, and I think that ties into what you were saying. And sure, it's easy to say leadership, and that sounds kind of generic, and everybody knows leadership is important. But it was more specifically, what did they do? The leadership was, and the leadership went in some cases all the way to the top executive in that jurisdiction. So either the president or the mayor or the governor of the state, the mayor of Sobral, and of course the leader of the education sector. So it was a tight collaboration between the executive of the entire district or region or whatever it was, the top executive, and the top executive of the education bureaucracy. That collaboration was key. And what characterized them was having that top executive kind of demand improvement in performance using metrics, but allowing the educators the freedom to decide how they're going to get there.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like demanding performance. You've got to do better. Please show us that you can do better. But I'm not going to micromanage you. I'll protect you if there's a political fallout. I'll protect you. I'm not going to micromanage you, but I am going to demand performance. You feel freedom in figuring out how you're going to get that performance. And I think that was key. That style of leadership, and that goes all the way down to the principals. Yeah. And now one thing that I would say though about the leadership also is that there was a lot of freedom to decide how you were going to get there, and it was fairly participatory and so on, and iterative and adaptive. But once they had a package, then that package became pretty prescriptive. So it's a weird mix of freedom with prescriptiveness. Of course, you can deviate from the prescriptiveness, but it's not every teacher do whatever they want by any means in many of these cases.
Beyond kind of the leadership components and the kind of setting of the targets, and even kind of setting some of the kind of core structures that ended up scaling, are there other kind of key takeaways from your work? Yeah.
Well, one would be around the use of data. These were all extremely data intensive efforts. And again, a lot of people say that, but maybe what's more interesting is how they use the data. And I would say the data was used to motivate. I mean, kind of to some extent, a kind of wake up call or shock value, if you will. Like the kids aren't reading. The kids are not doing math, even really simple problems they can't seem to do. And that mobilized the community and the political leaders. And then using the data to drive support to the teachers, but not hardcore accountability. So there was very little use of the data for, hardcore high stakes accountability. It was really mostly support. Now, I've seen cases where the accountability can help, but this was more collegial accountability. So I'm a coach. I see that you're not doing that well because I can see that in your data. I'm here to help. But, how can I help you improve your teaching? So I think that style of use of data was super important. I think focus, big lesson that, they said, well, the foundations of our system are not good. The kids aren't learning to read or do math. Let's get a victory here, and we'll do critical thinking in 5 years. So not try to do every kind of deep skill throughout K through 12 or whatever the equivalent is, but focus on a few things. So in Puebla, for example, they had just 3 goals. They had learning, and particularly focusing on those things, attendance, and primary school completion, and how all those go with each other. Because if the kids aren't learning and they're not attending, well, if they're not attending, they're not going to be learning. If they're not learning, they're not going to complete. So it's a very simple message. We want our kids completing primary school, which means they have to attend and they have to be learning while they're there. And similar kinds of goals. Very simple stuff. And then I would say the other big takeaway, a couple of more. One is while they were adapting and iterating. There was experimentation and everything. But once and as they began to hone and improve their approach, and by the way, these were out of the three, two were completely homegrown. Only Kenya had foreign assistance, outside assistance. I mean, they all did to some extent, but the inspiration and the basic design in Puebla and in Sobral was entirely and genuinely local. Anyway, as they began to hone their approaches, one thing that characterizes these is that there was a lot of coordination between the people who provide curriculum to the schools, the people who provide the suggested lesson plans, the people who provide the coaching, the assessment. So the kids are being assessed on pretty much the same thing that was in the lesson plans, pretty much the same content as was in the textbooks. So what you see in a lot of ministries is a kind of managerial failure of leadership, where the exams people are working on an approach that doesn't line up with a curriculum, that doesn't line up with what the teachers are being supported to do, what the principals should be on the lookout for. And so naturally, it's very hard to get anything done. Now, the danger of this highly coordinated approach is that if you get it wrong, you're going to get it spectacularly wrong. So that's why the process of adapting and iterating for at least a couple of good years, maybe 3, is so important, because once you get it right, then then the whole thing starts to click like a machine, and you get results. Now, so for instance, you talk to the people who did the Kenya stuff, they iterated the teacher lesson plans and the teacher guides 6 times to get it just so. And then I would say the other thing is, because this stuff was evidence-based and a lot of the evidence was local, and people could see that the evidence was local and was being genuinely grown out of their own practice, people had a lot more faith in the implementation. And I think that's really important in terms of leadership, because if the ministry starts telling the principals, you guys got to do X, Y, and Z, and that X, Y, and Z are not based on evidence, are not homegrown, and end up not working, you've just discredited the principals. Because you've told them to do something, they've tried to do it, and it doesn't work, and you've just undermined their leadership. And I think that was something that was done really well. In terms of teacher support, there were different models in Puebla, kind of a spectrum, really. In Kenya, it was largely outside the school. So the coaches would come in and visit with the teachers and help them. And in Sobral, the support to the teachers was entirely from the within school leadership. So there was like a pedagogical leader that supported the principal and the teachers. So it didn't have to be the principal himself or herself, but a pedagogical leader or a pedagogical resource person that supported the teachers and, in a sense, was accountable to the principal. Whereas in Puebla, it was a mixture of external coaching and in-school leadership. So that suggests that all 3 models can work. They just have to be well-tuned.
Yeah. Can I ask you just on the findings piece? So you kind of mentioned the leadership, some of the kind of data aspects, the coordination. I'm curious if there was anything around the kind of human capital management or like the kind of say HR practices type things that you saw in terms of like who's selected to be an educator, how the incentives they're given, those types of things, or was it mostly just kind of
very much so, especially in, well, not so much in Kenya. In Kenya, they really didn't touch or not very much. Well, I'm misrepresenting things. In Kenya, there was some tweaking of the HR function when it comes to the job definition of former school quality assurance officers or school inspectors or whatever, and try to turn them away from a kind of bureaucratic checklist approach, and maybe not a punitive approach, but semi-punitive approach, or like an inspectorate type approach, toward a coaching approach. And that did take some tweaking of the, not the HR function, but kind of, the job descriptions of these people. So that, but that was probably the most limited case. And that's a pretty good example of a limited use of HR functions to tweak the job descriptions to get them to be more supportive of the teachers, and of course get them trained up in how to be supportive and less inspection oriented. I mean, mind you, there's still an element of inspection but it's more a collegial thing where the teacher's not doing well. They've learned to respect the coach because they know that the coaches are giving advice that works, and so they try to look good to the coach because the coach is now a figure that you respect. And you seek their advice. I mean, all of us have had good bosses and bad bosses. And when you go to your good boss and for advice, and they give you advice and it works, you develop respect for them. And then you do stuff to try to look good in their eyes. It's a kind of professional or brotherly or sisterly accountability that I think works quite well, really. And then in the other cases, they had to tweak the systems. For example, in Sobral, to heighten the role of the figure of the school pedagogical leader, to select them competitively and on a competency basis, rather than the traditional sort of Brazilian nepotistic basis. In Puebla, they did innovations such as to elevate the role of the school visitors, or I forget the exact title, whether they're inspectors or whatever. They collegiated them into an academy, a professional academy, and so they began to develop a leadership academy, or a school, more like a school support academy, an academy of school coaches or school visitors. I forget the exact title. That was like a professional association of serious professionals, and that again heightened their role. So most definitely.
Okay. So you started talking about this a bit in your previous answer, but I'd like to ask you now specifically about the leadership at the school level. So GSL, we work on kind of supporting school leaders as a way of supporting education systems change. So this is all very relevant for our work. I'm curious, kind of specific to that kind of role of the leader at the school site. What are the implications of your work for that role?
I think it's pretty clear. And well, what the implication would be if you can do it right. And there's been more recently a lot of interest in the literature and in some of the field-based experiments and scale-ups around the fact that the coaching model definitely works. The external coaching model can work, but it is expensive. You have to have this layer of people visiting the schools, with a fuel budget, with a motorcycle budget, and so on and so forth. And so I think some of the realization is that if you can put that leadership and that support at school level, and in Sobral it's done mostly at school level, it's just a lot more efficient. So, aside from the fact that maybe it's more trusted because it's right there, and so let's put aside the sort of pedagogical and human side, and just from the sheer cost point of view, it's a lot more efficient to have your leadership right at the school level. So I think that's a clear implication. Now, that leadership has to be trained. So again, because leadership in a lot of developing countries at the school level is typically a kind of highly bureaucratic leadership. It's very oriented at dotting the I's and crossing the T's in terms of bureaucratic processes, not in terms of pedagogical issues. And so they did have to spend a lot of time training these leaders, or these teacher kind of in-house teacher coaches, maybe that's kind of their role, to both relate well to the principal, not try to take away the principal's power and roles, training the principal not to feel threatened by these people, but also in training these people up in some of the pedagogical issues, so that again, the support that they end up giving the teachers is evidence-based and works, and therefore these people are able to win the respect of the teachers because the advice that they give ends up working. So yeah, quite a bit of investment actually in and this is kind of train the trainers, but not really, because and it's not cascade at all. It's more like training the supporters, because the coaching model is not really a teacher training model. It truly is a coaching model. It's almost like in the athletic sense, where you're observing behavior in the soccer field, and you're saying, hey, maybe in this situation you want to look that way and see if the striker is there, and then you shoot, or then you pass to the striker. But in these situations, don't pass to the striker, whatever, pass backwards or whatever. So it's very situational training. So in that sense, it's not the kind of classical theoretical training that you see in a lot of countries. It's very based on observing the teacher in the classroom and saying, hey, let me help you with this.
Makes sense. Can I ask you, in terms of this leadership at the school level, one of the questions that I've been thinking about recently is, where does investment in leadership at the school level, is there kind of a sequence that needs to be followed in terms of systems change? So are there kind of things you need to have in place before you can stay focused on that kind of the educators, or particularly the leadership at the school level, like say an orientation towards learning outcomes, or some basic kind of like people practices in place first? Or do you think these are all kind of things that work in parallel and you're kind of pushing on all fronts? I don't know if there's anything kind of.
I would say that in the experiences that I studied, they were developed in parallel. So you need to have that role of that person, and that may be evolving over the first 2 or 3 years. The role of the in-school leader, or the coaches, or whatever, that role needs to be grown and developed and better specified over time. And you need to put in place the mechanisms for selecting them competitively rather than nepotistically, and so on and so forth. While at the same time, you need to be honing the professional content of what they're going to do. And that may take 2 or 3 years to evolve as well. That here's what the lesson plans are going to look like. Here's how you support the style of lesson plan, and so on and so forth. So I think, and if you were to sequence them, I think it would take longer. I mean, it wouldn't fail, but it would take longer. So you want to develop them in parallel, so that after about 2 or 3 years, both the kind of administrative job description selection processes are working, and there's some content to go along with it. If you were to develop the bureaucratic stuff first, and there's no content to go along with it, I don't think it's going to fail, but A, it'll take longer, and B, how do you do professional practice without content? On the other hand, if you've got content, but you don't have a good professional approach, practice, then what do you do with the content? So I think what I saw was they seem to have developed them more or less at the same time, more or less in parallel, and iterating, taking probably 2 or 3 years to do it right.
Got it. Okay. So maybe the last question here, Luis, for you is, as we kind of look ahead, what would you say are the key questions about the role and impact of school leaders that you think are important to answer over the next few years, say?
Yeah. Well, I would say it's around either empowering the school leaders to be in tune with the pedagogical content of the change that the system is trying to make. We're going to have much more active lesson plans, less passive lesson plans. How, as a school leader, do you support that? Or in some cases, it could be that the school leader stays as a largely bureaucratic figurehead, or takes care of the paperwork and the management, and then there's a deputy principal or a teacher support leader, and the pedagogical leadership is to a significant degree in that person. So I
Hmm.
think understanding the high importance of pedagogical leadership and finding some way of providing that without necessarily saying, let's say you have a system that's highly devolved to the school level, which means that the principal then has a lot of bureaucratic duties. They have to make sure that the procurement that the school does is competitive, because no longer is the school simply given the chalk and the pencils and the papers and so on, but the principal has to procure it. It has to procure it competitively and transparently. Or let's say that there's a devolved school budget that the principal has to manage and post and get the parents' assembly to approve the budget. Those are all administrative duties. And if those are
Hmm.
big because the system is devolved and decentralized, it may mean that the principal has genuine and important administrative duties and will have no time for pedagogical leadership. In that case, you need to figure out how to supply that with someone who's the deputy principal or the head of instruction or some kind of figure in the school that does that. Or if you can't do it in the school, do a mix, like in Puebla, with some support from the outside or entirely support from the outside, like in Kenya. Those models can work as long as that leadership, and I would call leadership and support or supportive leadership, is supplied in some way. I
Hmm.
think that's critical, and that was critical in all of the three cases.
Fascinating. I think that that model for where's the pedagogical leadership going to come in, I think
Yeah.
is
I think
interesting one.
it goes without question that that needs to be there. That's a key lesson. I
Hmm.
think another key lesson is that that can be supplied in different ways, depending on
Hmm.
context, depending on how busy the school head is with genuine and legitimate administrative duties. As long as it's not make work administrative, because in some systems, if the principal doesn't feel like they have the capacity to be a good pedagogical leader, they might get into make work bureaucratic duties, because it's easier to
Right.
get busy fixing the photocopier
Hmm.
maybe than to get busy helping the teachers how to teach better. And so as long as they're sort of genuine and important administrative duties that the principals have, then putting the pedagogical stuff on somebody else, as long as that leadership is there somehow.
Makes sense. Great. Well, this has been really thought provoking. Thank you so much,
Good,
Luis, for joining us.
good. Glad to help.
Thank you.
All right.